according to Cloud. Right, so we're going to move on to the weapon that I knew. Well, every time I talk about Cutlass or like naval stuff, this is a weapon that I always get asked about, which is the boarding axe. This is actually meant to be a Viking axe. Most boarding axes have a spike out the back. I was watching Matt Easton video on this, and he was saying that apparently people used to use them as climbing axes to climb up onto any ship. But the idea within the British Navy was that the boarding axe is more or less a tool. You know, it wasn't really considered as a weapon. Whereas in the American Navy, like the United States Navy of the period, the boarding axe was considered more of also a weapon, not just a tool. Probably because in North America there was a tradition of axe fighting. I mean, even in the American Civil War, there were apparently Ranger regiments and things like that had a tomahawk, or even were issued with tomahawks instead of bayonets. Or that might have been the Revolutionary War. I might be getting those two mixed up. But you know, like North America has a tradition of axe fighting that you don't see in the British Isles. Whereas conversely, the British Isles has a very strong tradition of cut and thrust sword fighting with single stick and also back swording. So, you know, much more likely to culturally gravitate towards cutlass. Although apparently also the French Navy considered the boarding axe more of a weapon in its own right as well. So, which I don't know why, because, you know, as I can tell, France had neither a tradition of axe fighting, although they did. Their tradition of saber, of cut and thrust sword, was very much a military weapon. Like you look at French manuals, and nearly all depictions of saber, you know, show it as a weapon used by people in military uniforms. So, you know, I don't know why the French thought axe more a weapon than the British did, but apparently they did. So I'm going to look at axe as an adjunct to the sword. So grab my trusty sword. You know, mostly because again, if this is considered a tool, certainly there are times when you would use it as a weapon, particularly as, like Pringle Green points out, on a lot of ships there were only half as many cutlasses as there were crew. So, you know, it very well may be that you'd find yourself in a boarding action and not have a cutlass, but you might have an axe handy. Conversely, you might be in the United States Navy in the period, or the French Navy, and up it up. But my kind of if I'm going to do stuff on single axe, I'll probably do that as a separate video. This is looking at the axe as a tool you have if you've kind of extrapolated Pringle Green's advice of just, you know, use your pistol in your offhand so that you've always got your sword out. And you've got your boarding axe, and you're like, oh, well, you know, I bring this axe on board the enemy ship to like chop through doors or chop ropes, or, you know, but like I've got it with me anyway. Why don't I just use it in my offhand so I've got my cutlass ready just in case I'm attacked? What can I do? So guarding like this works okay. The big risk though is, so when I've got my pistol, my hand is on the far side of the attack. The attack this is meant to stop. So the attack is coming in this side, and to get to my hand, they're basically going to have to turn the attack into an attack on the opposite side, which, you know, is certainly possible and is a risk. But even then, if they're doing that, my hand is a relatively small target compared to my face or my shoulder. So yeah, it's kind of, I can see people doing it as a showy thing, but again, you know, my solution to that is just pull the hand out of the way and stab them in the face. With the axe, my hand is on the same side as the attack, and an attack could accidentally come in and hit my hand. So I'm not a big fan of the idea of just going, oh, well, I'll just use the axe. I'll just put the axe above my head the same way I do with a dagger or a pistol. One, because the risk to the hand, but the other is the risk of this also hitting your roof. But yeah, so what I recommend with the axe is hold it low, hold it down here. And there is So it's actually an early 20th century. It's like 1905 method of saber fencing that is very dirty fighting, where they use scabbard and the guy he holds it down here. So kind of like the dagger guard, but lower, so sitting right down. And this gives me the option, and the primary option I want with this, I'm doing it from a TS guard. You can equally use a head guard if you want. The advantage of this is I can sweep my axe up, edge. That's not to avoid hooking. Honestly, if I hook, it's probably good. But this is a beat. This is I'm clobbering my enemy out of the way and using the weight of the axe head to displace my opponent's sword. So the motion is I turn my hand over. I turn my hand over. That's actually quite important as initial impetus. I turn my hand over and I basically pull it up to not quite, to basically this position. So if you've looked at any of if you're familiar with 19th century sort of hand position, French hand positions, the British use the same hand position numbering as the French, which is why I use it. This position here with my hand palm up in line with the outside of my body is 6. With this guard, I'm basically whipping up to 6 with making a slight adjustment in height, depending on where my opponent's sword is or my opponent's attack is. I'm striking my opponent's weapon out of the way. So from here, bang. And it also helps to retract your elbow. So if you've ever done karate, you'll notice that this movement, bringing your hips all the way back, is quite powerful. Or if you've ever done like wrestling, pulling to the hip like this and twisting the torso is quite powerful. And same thing here. I'm turning, actually when I do this, I'm going to start with my hips a bit more forward than I would for a single sword, which is also true of dagger, to be honest. Anytime you've got an offhand weapon, you need to be a bit more squared up to keep the weapon in play. And bang, straight in. So hand down by my hip, tip sort of sitting there. I like to have the edge forward in case I want to come up or in case I want to do a different technique. But bang, straight back up, and this will displace my opponent's sword. So I'll just use a head guard because I actually taught you guys that earlier in the lesson. So turn and strike, turn and strike, turn and strike, turn and strike. Obviously, this then is combined with an attack. So from a head guard, I strike and attack. And I'm using this turn to basically uncurl my weapons. This does take a bit of practice to coordinate. You do not want, you don't want to do this. You don't want to do this without like a reasonable amount of practice in a bout, just because you can temper your own weapons. So strike, 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 and strike. Right. So that's kind of the beat with the axe. The other option with the axe is hooking. I've not tried this out as of yet. So a lot of this stuff is, as it were, experimental. But I can also hook, which is what I would probably do if I'm faced with, say, a bayonet or a boarding pike or a spear, or even like a small sword, like a thrusting weapon that I want to clear. From here, I hook. So I'm basically just flicking very slightly. There's nowhere near as much impetus in this. And what I'm relying on is that I will get enough leverage to displace the weapon. And then the head of the axe means that for my opponent to come back, they need to come all the way around the head of the axe, which gives me a lot of time to strike. So hook, just this motion. Straight up, my hand is moving from this position to about the height of my shoulder. The way it moves in flight is going to be slightly adjusted depending on where the opponent's weapon is, but it's going to end up in the same place. It's just if my opponent is coming in at my stomach, it's a straight movement. If my opponent is coming at my face, it's an arced movement, but basically the same movement, just bang, bang, bang. So up and And the advantage of this is it gives me a bit more time before I need to launch my riposte. So I hook and attack, hook and attack, hook and attack, damage your roof, hook and attack, and hook and attack. Let me just quickly check those chat messages, just make sure the sound, like there's not like bizarre farting noise or something in the sound. All right, cool. Of course, we have a comment. Something to orientation I got before. I found that holding the X closely actually allowed for controlled blocking. The X could always slide through the hand to move back to the handle. Also found my experimentation that hooking is very useful and can be used against almost any kind of weapon, especially if in company at the same time as attack. So this is a comment from Hearn. And yeah, that's a really cool idea. So if you want, so what Hearn was saying for those who, is if you hold the axe down here near the head, you can basically get to the same position as you have with the dagger, with the parrying, with a knife, and with the pistol, where you're covering your forearm with the axe. And what he was also saying was that you can very, very quickly get back and attack with the axe very, very quickly, which is really cool. That's a really cool idea, Hearn, actually, that just, starting from here and coming in, and changing as needed, especially in the context of, if my opponent has parried here, like if my opponent has a parried blow, I can sort of chamber the axe. And I guess potentially with a bit of practice, although I'm not going to do this with a valuable camera in the room or my phone, you could actually switch in flight, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, that's a really, really cool comment. And also, hooking, as Hearn also said, hooking is really useful against any weapon. Most of my experimentation with axe was done doing Viking Age reenactment. So I found that the axe was reasonably good for hooking shields. And also you could use the head to trap against opponent's weapons. So trap a weapon with your axe and your other weapon, or your axe and your shield. So stuff like if I do a parry of 6, so my opponent's sword is out here, I can then trap. I can bring the axe up and then trap both. So if you imagine my opponent's sword is along this axis, going here because I parried in 6, I can trap their sword, and then use the time they take to either free their sword, or if we're fighting equal weapons, so if it's sword and axe versus sword and axe, because the sword arm is in the way of their own axe, they're going to have to do a big movement to come in, which gives me the opportunity to follow up. So just to show you that again, I parry 6, trap with the axe, and then follow up, and I'm bringing my axe into kind of a prime position, because if you imagine, if I've thrown an attack, my arm is going to be trapped over here. My hand's going to be in the way. If I want to bring my axe into play, my arm is going to be in the way. So I have to, if I want to wrench back or try and wrench loose or clear the weapons, I'm giving my opponent a chance to cut, like an opening, a tempo, a single action to come in. So from here, 6, hook, return. And I actually recommend covering yourself with basically a prime parry, but with an axe, to come back in. So 6, hook, and then prime thrust, or thrust in 6 with a prime axe parry. You get the idea though. So, from here, 6, hook, and thrust. I'll do that backwards. 6, hook, thrust. 6, hook, thrust. 6, hook, thrust. And once more for luck. Thrust. And back to guard. Yeah. I wonder also actually it was an extension of sort of Hearn's axe guard. If you could also, like if I'm holding it just below the head, if this sort of thing where you parry And if your sword is unavailable or just your opponent comes barreling in, you can actually punch in with the axe head. I wonder if that would be a viable technique. Maybe. Yeah, so that's sort of, so the other thing with the axe is, certainly if you're intending to use the axe offhanded whilst boarding a ship, because the primary reason you've got the axe is chop stuff, chop through doors, chop through rigging, that kind of thing, which you'd want to practice, which would be fairly easy to practice, honestly, if you're using the axe as part of just general labor on the ship or just chopping wood in port or whatever. Just practice it with your left hand, doubly so to get the strength up. You do have the option, of parry and chop with the axe as well. So if I'm here, max low, I can parry and chop with the axe. I want to use my sword to cover me as well, because swords are a better parrying device than axe, especially if they've got a complex hilt. So would certainly be possible to do stuff like this, where I parry and come in with the axe, just to surprise my opponent. So parry, axe, parry, axe, parry, axe, parry, axe, parry, axe, or parry, axe. This movement could also be used offensively. So if my opponent is holding their sword high, or they've got weapon that they're holding high enough that I can cover them both with this parry, I can get this sword sort of connecting with both of them. What I can do is form a position with the sword and come in with the axe. There's actually a lot of Viking Weapons reenactors I met who their trick is that they fight with sword and axe, and they hook with the axe and hit with the sword. And this is sort of the inverse of that, where you cover with the sword and hit with the axe, cover with the sword and hit with the axe, and cover with the sword and hit with the axe. So yeah, that's kind of my rough, axe approximation of what sword and axe could potentially be like. As much as it's not really a historically documented system, I think it's important to understand that, most fencing in the 19th century with a sword was just single sword. Even the stuff that is documented was still quite uncommon. And sword and axe, as far as I know, not really documented, but it is still cool. It's kind of fun to experiment with. And as much as it's maybe not a strictly historical practice, knowing how it would be approached by someone practicing historical martial arts is useful if you're, if you're writing fiction, you want kind of an authentic style, or, you've got like a role-playing character, something a little bit odd, or just, you just want to have a bit of fun with, and kind of imagine the variability that would come up with weapons. All right, so I'm just going to kick my camera, and while I'm adjusting that, if you want to ask any questions or make any comments, now is the time. So are there any questions, comments, any other statements, just generally? I know there's a few of you who don't have microphones, so if you are furiously typing, I'll just give you a moment and try and recount a historical fact. So actually, when I was researching Pringle Green, I looked a little bit into British naval tactics and British ships in the period, and yeah, it was really interesting because in effect, if you assume that if you assume that a lot of sailors were not necessarily, were not strictly speaking military, about half the ship's complement of a naval ship was Marines, who were kept quite separate from the rest of the crew, except for the officers, like the captain. And part of their job was basically just prevent mutinies, to keep everyone in line. And when I heard that, I'm like, wow, that really paints a very different picture, to what was, what you'd expect, or what I expected going in, which was that, people would be recruited to the Navy and then kind of come up through the Navy. The difference between maybe a Marine and maybe the difference between like a Marine and a sailor is that the sailor is expected to have skills going in, but it seems like there was enough tension within the relationship to warrant, having Marines there to or like one of the Marines' main duties was to keep the rest of the crew in line. We got a comment. Actually, there we go. So Patrick S points out that Bligh of the Botany had no Marines. Interesting. I didn't realize that because I know, like, when Bligh got to Australia, Bligh was I'm assuming you're talking about Governor Bligh of Australia, or New South Wales colony. He was, which was in Australia, but it was the colony of New South Wales at the time. That's kind of interesting because he had a mutiny on the way over, and then was ultimately deposed by the Rum Corps. Like there was a coup in New South Wales because he was just such a disaster of a governor. Mutiny of the HMAS Bounty. So I don't know if that's the Australian Bligh ship or if you're talking about someone else, but yeah, like, I know it just seems like a really, really interesting turn of fate that Governor Bligh, who did have a mutiny on his ship as he was coming over to Australia, same Bligh. All right, sweet. Thank you, Patrick. It is the same Bligh. It's kind of funny that he has a mutiny on his ship because there weren't any Marines on the ship to keep people in line. And then he gets over to Australia where there are Marines and there's a coup against him by the Marines because he was trying to shut down the Rum Corps. Incidentally, the coup, the Rum Rebellion as it was called, happened on January 26th or so. So it happened about the same time, around the same time as what ultimately became Australia Day, although not till like some incredible amount of, possibly over 100 years later, like Australia Day on January 28th, 26th, 28th. I'm not Patreon enough to remember the exact days, sorry. But that time of year, celebrating the planting of the British flag in New South Wales colony before there were any colonies in the other parts of Australia, and also the official annexation of Australia by the British, which is a little bit insensitive to the Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples of Australia, is a relatively recent thing. And there's a lot of people who joke every Australia Day that what we should actually be celebrating is the Rum Corps, deposing Governor Bligh. So there's a bit of Australian trivia for you. I know we've got a few people from North America who are tuning in. I know also the recordings are very sort of very popular around the world. Or they're not popular, but like the viewership is quite geographically diverse, I guess. Well, I'm assuming there's no questions, so I'm just going to pause before we come back for the next weapon.